abilities is interrupting interesting conversations to get people's attention diverted away. I'm David Layton-Brown, the Master of McLaughlin College. Welcome to the latest in our lunch talks. I believe everyone's done this, but let me just remind any students present to please sign in at the register at the back, not because we're trying to intrude on your privacy, but we want to give you a certificate of participation for attending 6 or more of our lunch talks. And the only way we'll know if you've attended 6 or more is if you've signed in on 6 or more occasions. This particular talk is interesting for 3 reasons. The first is that it was a casualty of the QP strike last spring. Eleanor was going to deliver this talk then, and because of the labor disruption, that had to be canceled. We are fortunate, you are fortunate, that she is available to come back and do it now. Secondly, it's interesting because this is one of the talks that I unimaginatively call faculty research profiles. And they are a direct response to what students have told us they want. So I'm glad you have voted with your feet and proven that that's true. Students tell us that they want to get to know faculty members better. And when we follow up and say, what do you want to know about faculty members, because we're a pretty dull, uninteresting bunch, they say, we want to know what faculty members actually do when they're not standing in front of a class teaching. And so I have asked some of our speakers to reflect on the questions that have interested them so much that they've devoted their entire career to learning more about those issues, and how they actually go about learning about those issues, which is to say, what do they do hour after hour, day after day, week after month after year, and what are some of the interesting things that they've learned along the way. So Eleanor is going to do one of those kinds of talks, rather than a talk about a specific subject, which we have many of. And then thirdly, this is interesting because of what she's going to talk about, and I'm not going to take away your thunder or put words in your mouth, but she's going to talk about innovative organizations. All of us are part of organizations. All of us are certainly subject to the actions of organizations. And anything that would help us to understand what makes organizations more or less effective will be really interesting. So I will stop talking and turn the imaginary microphone over to Eleanor Glor.
Thank you. Well, it's really a pleasure to have an opportunity to talk about my research generally. And I thought I'd begin by just positioning me so you know who you're looking at. I am a person who worked as a public servant almost all my life. I worked for 6 different governments, ended my career as a public servant with the federal government. And during that time, I had the opportunity to work for an innovative government, and therefore have had an opportunity to compare it to other governments, and got really interested in what that means. What an innovative government means, and how you can demonstrate that. So since the late 80s, I've been studying and publishing about public sector innovation, initially about that government, which was the government of Saskatchewan, and since then on more fundamental questions related to innovation. I did 2 other things I hope to create more knowledge about innovation. One is I set up a dinner meeting once a month where we talked about specific innovations. I did that for 10 years in Ottawa. The other is I started publishing the Innovation Journal, which is a public sector innovation published on the internet. So I've had lots of opportunity to read others' papers, to get a sense of what people are interested in the field. Now, what I thought I would do is just jump ahead to the topic that interests me now, which is are innovations actually good for the organizations that sponsor them? What got me interested in that question is that there's a lot of promotion of innovation, as you know. There isn't a lot of evaluation of it. We don't have a lot of sense of whether it accomplishes what it sets out to accomplish, whether there's measurable effects. But also, to my knowledge, there is almost no literature at all, except what I've written, about the impact that innovations have on their organizations. And I came at it from the question, if public servants are reluctant to innovate, as some people say, I don't believe that, but some people say that, if that were true, why would that be true? Do they know something that we're not acknowledging? That it's bad for them, that it's bad for the organization? And my experience is that most public servants are actually more concerned about their organization and their programs than they are about themselves and what happens to them. So I got thinking about that and started to do some work on that question. It's a big question, it's not easy to answer. So I've published papers on all of the things I'm going to talk about, or have written papers that aren't published yet. And if you'd like to have a look at them, you can go to this site. I'd just like to mention that there are people writing about public sector innovation worldwide, and in Canada, the people who are writing about it are Sanford Bournes, who's at U of T. He was trained at Harvard, so he studies case studies, which is the Harvard method. Luc Bernier, who studies mostly the databases from award programs, the submissions to innovation award programs. And Ian Gao, who has studied administrative innovations, and me. So we're the people in Canada who are doing most of the work on innovation. And if you would like to look at what I've published, it's under editorial board. I'm on the editorial board, and my resume has what I've published. So the elements that I have worked on so far to try to answer this question, what's the impact of innovations on their organizations? I started by saying, well, if we could get some data on this question, how would we know what it meant? What would we be able to compare it to? So I had a look at what we already know about what happens to organizations generally. And there's a literature on that, a demographic literature, organizational demography. So it's on populations of organizations, and it exists in the private, public, and nonprofit sectors. So that was quite useful, and I had a look at what's happened with departments in the federal government to see whether we could have some Canadian data on this. And I looked at Hodgetts, who studied the Canadas prior to the creation of the Dominion of Canada, and I looked at what happened since Confederation. And that's what I talked about the last time I was here, was that study, which was published in Canadian Public Administration. The benefit of that study was that I looked at all the studies I could find, and I found about 32. Quite a few of them were biased. I was really surprised. And I ended up with about 22, something like that really seemed to be about normal organizations that didn't have a population that was biased in some way that would skew the development of a normal mortality rate figure. And I calculated the mean, the average mortality rate for organizations. By the way, it's under 1.03% per year, so it's quite low. And it's even lower in the private and nonprofit sectors than it is in the public sector. I was really surprised by that So I had a look at that, and then I started to think about the questions you have to think about to answer the question. So definitions, for example, you used the term innovative organization. Well, what's an innovative organization? That's a comparative statement, isn't it? More innovative than somebody else. So then you need to know what's a typical level of innovation in an organization. And I don't think we know that because we don't have any population studies of innovations. And I defined a population in the public sector as a government. One government is a population. We don't have any studies that tell us what the mortality rates are, and we don't have any studies of what a typical level of innovation is. How many innovations in 10 years does a population introduce in order to be able to be called innovative? So I don't use that term. I use innovating organization because that's a different question. I just say if they're innovating, we want to look at them. And I look at some of that work in the book. Then I developed a framework, I'm going to hand it out at the end, for studying this question. And I realized, I found myself, I heard a fellow from the OECD give a talk. He was talking about innovative businesses, and what he was really talking about was dissemination of innovation, and trying to get businesses to tell them whether they'd adopted a list of innovations. So that's the dissemination of innovation. That's not introducing things that are really new. And it irritated me, and so I kept thinking about it. The reason it irritated me is because I realized that I was actually, in the work I'd done on Saskatchewan, I was studying a population. They were studying individual businesses, and they were studying dissemination. I was studying how many innovations did this government adopt during this one government. And with others, we wrote 2 books on this, and we identified 160 innovations in an 11-year period. Nothing to compare it to, but that's a wonderful database to have. And that is data for a population, so that's somewhere to work from. The framework, developing this framework helped me to understand that there are a number of different ways of studying innovation, and the people who are studying it are using different definitions of innovation, what an innovation is it dissemination, or is it something brand new? In our work on Saskatchewan, we defined it as the first, second, or third time something had been adopted not in the population, in the community of the government. And I defined that as the group of governments that the government of Saskatchewan looked at to compare themselves to. And that, in this case, was governments in North America and governments in Canada. And so that's a definition you can only use if you're studying a population. And it's different than saying an innovation is something that's new to McLaughlin College, new to York University, new to the organization adopting it, which is often the definition that's used. And that focuses on the individual organization, and it means that every organization that adopts that innovation is being innovative. And I didn't see it that way. I saw it in being innovative as adopting something that was very new to your government, that was a real challenge to implement. So just looking at definitions alone in the framework, you can see that you end up with quite different ways of looking at the issue of innovation, which doesn't get dealt with in the literature typically. Often people will publish on innovation without defining it. And so developing this framework for me really helped me to understand better the literature I was reading, how people were coming at it, and how that it was different from what I had done. And I had just started identifying innovations. I didn't think about any of that when I was trying to figure out what was innovative in the government of Saskatchewan. So this was helpful to me, and I also concluded that really innovations ought to be studied all of these ways. There's nothing wrong with any of those definitions. So what I also realized is that different paradigms of thinking or philosophies go with the different approaches. And as well, you use different methodologies for each of them. So there are 4. And as I say, I'm going to hand it out a little later. The 4 of them really need to be studied different ways. So the 4 ways of studying innovation are through case studies, and better still, comparing 2 or more case studies to each other. Secondly, studying the impacts on people. And I haven't been able to find any literature on that at all, so if anybody knows of any, please let me know. Thirdly, looking at the factors that are correlated with being innovative, and with organizational mortality. And there's a lot of literature on that. And it's what management schools tend to focus on, those factors. And then the 4th way is organizational demography, looking at the numbers of innovations in populations and what happens, and in organizations. So those are the 4 ways of studying them. And the paper that's a proposal expands on the structural approach. Another paper we've done on this subject was what I'd really like to see happen is that we could go back to these Saskatchewan innovations and see what happened to them, and see what happened to the organizations that introduced them, and the organizational level up. So if it was a unit that introduced an innovation, what happened to its division, the level up? If it was a division that was set up to run this new program, what happened to its one level up, its directorate? And I don't think we know what a normal way of organizations developing and disappearing is, so this would also be unique just in looking at that. And then, of course, the other question is whether you keep finding information, because it's 40 years later, but that's the periods of time that you need to do demography. So Gary Ewart and I tested this approach to see if we could get the information. We went back to annual reports and estimates and whatever other reports we could have, and we found that you could identify how many staff were attached to the bigger programs. You could find out when they were created from the annual report. But the government that followed this government, this was the Blakely government, the one that followed it was a neoliberal government, and they stopped reporting on personnel. So there was a big foo-for-ah, they were laying people off, so they just stopped reporting on it. So you can't find out what happened to personnel, whether the people, the numbers of people stayed the same or changed. So it was interesting that, transparency is in part about continuing to report on things in a regular manner so that people can see there are changes. And this interfered with that. But we found enough information that we could actually report on these 5 innovations. And in fact, what happened with them is the one that was beneficial to business survived, and none of the others did. The income security programs run by the Social Services Department were abolished by this neoliberal government. So I did a paper on factors, and factors is complicated to study. So factors are, let me give you an example. demographic factors are things like age, but they're also changes in mortality rates over time. And there's a literature on that, and that literature has found that organizations are more likely to die when they're young and when they're small and when they're poorly financed. And that tends to have an impact on them initially, or if that changes over time. So that there's quite a good and solid literature on that. And so I was able to draw on that, but it's not about innovating organizations, it's just about organizations. But it gives us something to compare them to. And there are big bun fights in that field about what those factors are. What strikes me about them is that there's a lot of factors. And of course, you can't look at everything. So if you want to go back and look at Saskatchewan, what factors, A, or can you collect information on, and B, do you want to collect information on? You have to make some decisions about what you think might have been important. So I think ideology is important. There's literature that supports that. But there's far more factors that have been identified in the literature than we can find information on and that we could deal with. You just can't study everything. So one of the things that we have to look at is what to study. And I've done a paper on this in which I have identified what I think might be the factors that are really important in innovation. And I have actually been responsible for implementing innovations, and I've studied them, and I've worked in the Department of Finance and funded them. So I have a few angles at which I can look at this question. So I've just finished my part of a chapter for a book that looks at this slightly differently. It looks at 4 hypotheses about what the fate of innovating organizations could be. So innovation could have no effect. It could lead to more mortality. It could lead to less mortality. It could lead to mortality at different stages of the life of the organization. And I've looked at the literature from that perspective. What's the support for each of those hypotheses? And as I say, the only one of those that there's very much literature on is the factors. But I collected what I could, and as I say, I found nothing on personnel, and that interests me that there's no literature on the effects of innovation on personnel. Because I think the innovations do have an effect on people. And everything that happens in government has an effect on people. And somehow, so I'm either not accessing the right literature, which could be true, or this is a neglected area and maybe it's ripe for study. I'm no good. So when I was talking up factors, I should have been on this slide. So I wanted to talk a little bit, as I guess I already did, about what I think should be studied. So I talked to you a little about the kinds of studies I've done, and to my knowledge, I'm the only person working on this. But I've submitted papers to journals, and I find it very interesting that the Administrative Administrative Organizations Journal and their conference this year has put this on as one of the topics that they're writing papers for. So somebody from that world reviewed one of my papers, I think, and said, this is an interesting question. So I'm trying to decide if I should try to go to that conference and whether I can come up with money for it. Because this is the first time that I've found anyone else who's been interested in it. And if other people are giving papers on that topic, I'd like to be there and hear those papers. So that's very exciting. That could lead to more research on this topic. The questions I'm thinking about as I'm thinking about how to do this research and what the questions are some of them are these. So, does innovation have an independent effect on the fate of organizations? So that's fundamental to what interests me. if innovation doesn't have an independent effect, then we're going to have trouble finding it and studying it. I think it does, but you know, it's a question that I have to be able to answer positively. Secondly, I spoke a bit about this already, what to study. There's so many factors that it's possible to think might be important. How are innovation and fate related? Which is the independent, which is the dependent variable? And its impact on, as I say, innovations, organizations, people, factors, and the population, i.e. the government. And the key question, is it likely that innovation enhances or reduces organizational mortality? And there is literature on the effects of change on organizations, most of it in the private sector, but I think it's relevant. I think that change is one of the things that's involved in introducing an innovation. I suspect, no proof, that the effect of a change and an innovation are not going to be identical, because organizations often change because they're in trouble. They've had a budget cut, they're on their knees, whatever. More often than with innovation, when an organization changes, it's already in trouble. And there's a literature that demonstrates that innovation usually occurs when organizations have money, some slack, you know, the government's not in deficit. It's then that they turn to what could we do about this key issue that we haven't been able to address, and now we have some resources, maybe we could do something. So I think for the most part, and that was my experience in Saskatchewan, and Saskatchewan's the only government I ever worked for that I thought was truly innovative. In my definition, it adopted so many innovations. So I think that the situation the organization's in when it innovates will generally be a better one than when it changes. And so the results might be different than they are with change. Now what happens with change, and that's all we know, is that an organization that changes in a population, when organizations change, more of them die, and the definition of that is disappear from the record. More of them disappear than with normal organizations, with organizations that are just chugging along. So there's this profile that occurs where the mortality rate goes up when they're young and adolescent, it turned out. So not right away. Adolescence comes at different points for different populations, and then it evens off. The mortality rate evens off to be like it is for normal organizations. So that profile's been found a lot of times already. So that will probably occur with innovations as well. Innovation might not work, they might not successfully implement it, they may implement it and then the government changes, and if there's been a change recently, it's more easy to have another change. That's been observed quite a number of times. So there'll be an increase in mortality, and then it'll even off, if it is the same as with change. And I'm predicting that it might even be a better profile with innovations. But I don't know, because with Saskatchewan, the next government, there was a change of ideology, and they got rid of a bunch of the innovations, but they didn't get rid of them all. And I'd really like to see us go back and look at what happened. I think that there'll be a certain kind of innovation that was contrary to their ideology, like income security innovations, that they got rid of. But there'll be lots that they didn't get rid of. And we are so fortunate to have this database in this, for a population. I really hope at some point that gets studied. So, that's the issue of, is it likely innovation enhances or reduces organizational mortality? We don't know. So, another question in doing research like this is which organizations to study. And I've made up my mind about this. I think you should study both the innovation, the organization that put the innovation in place, and the organization above it that supervises it, that it's part of, and see what happens to those organizations. There is a problem in that some organizations were created specifically to implement the innovation. And how do you handle that? Because there's a one-to-one relationship between the innovation and the organization. Sometimes what happens is initially the innovation gets cut back and then it disappears. So in that case, the organization might stay around or it might get amalgamated. So how do you get at the more interesting question to me, which is, what is that impact of the innovation on the organization, especially if you've got a directorate that is responsible for, say, 4 programs. That's quite typical. And the one disappears and the others don't. So that's a question to be solved. There are a few other kinds of challenges in this research. One is, as I say, there is an opportunity to do a population study, but there was a change of ideology at the end of that government. How do you handle that? And in which decisions was that a factor, and which ones was it not a factor? How do you determine that? So, as you can see, there's lots of issues to sort out, and there's lots of issues that could be studied in this. And I've been working pretty much alone on this, but to go back and look at 160 innovations is going to take a lot of work, and it's going to have to be done in Regina. So I hope that I will eventually get some funding to try to sort out some of these, what I think are important questions about innovation. And, of course, in every case, we'll have to make decisions about how to measure these things. I've given you definitionally, sometimes you do that, and I've given you some examples of those. So that's where I'm at with the research. I've published a number of papers on it. And the next one I'd like to do is to look at all 160 of those innovations and find out what happened to them and to the organizations. And I've listed a few questions here, the next slide, that I thought might be interesting for us to discuss. And I'd appreciate your input, what your thoughts are in listening to this research program, and if you have any suggestions or thoughts about it, or any questions.
Question. So can you give us some examples of the innovations that the Saskatchewan government adopted one of those 160?
Oh. Well, we studied 5 of them, as I mentioned, to see what happened to them. And one was a workers' compensation innovation, and the other 4 were programs of the Department of Social Services. They were new income security programs. So, for example, one was called the Family Income Plan, and it was a subsidy for working families who had children who were poor. And the thinking about it was that welfare was enough to live on if you were single or, no, I'm sorry, that's not right. The idea was that the minimum wage was sufficient for 1 or 2 people to live on. But that if you had children, you couldn't live on the minimum wage. So it was a concern that people living at the minimum wage with children just didn't have enough to live on. So this subsidy was introduced. That was the first time in Canada that a province introduced a subsidy for working families.
You said early on that part of the task of a researcher is to determine which factors to study. You can't study everything. And I believe you said there were some things that you couldn't find information
Yes.
on. What is your biggest unanswered question? What would you have liked to be able to study but couldn't find information on?
Well, I mentioned it already. I would have liked to have known what happened to the full-time equivalents, the people, whether the people that had been assigned to these programs, what happened to them? How many of them remained, you know, if the program got cut, if it got reduced as opposed to cut.
Would you have a hypothesis about that you'd like to test?
What I would really like to do is go back and interview some of those people and find out how that affected their careers and how they felt about it now. Whether they were glad that they went and worked for that program, whether it stayed forever or disappeared. You know, when people are innovating, they're really excited. And that experience doesn't last forever typically. It's something you do for a while and then you don't do it anymore for whatever reason it is. And that's so exciting when you're doing it. And then after that, it can be the case that everything feels kind of flat, you know. You know, I'd really like to sit and talk with a representative sample of those people and find out what that experience was like. Certainly for me, working on innovation was very exciting. You know, some didn't work, some did. Some worked spectacularly. It was very exciting and interesting. And it was early in my career. And, but there were people in the Department of Social Services. There was a change in values with the NDP government, the Social Democratic government. Prior to that, income security and social services had been reluctantly given, and people who were on welfare were checked up on and were humiliated. And there was a history in Saskatchewan because the Great Depression of the 1930s had been worse there than practically anywhere. And Relief, which was the federal government's welfare program during the 1930s, was really humiliating. And so that's what welfare became as well. And the NDP wanted to look at needing to help people with their income as something that could happen to anybody at some stage of their lives, and was not any indication about the value of the person or what they could contribute or would contribute. They wanted to get away from that approach. Now, the people who worked in the Department of Social Services were used to checking up on people, and you know, they'd been delivering this old style program. This was hard for them. And when the neoliberal government came in, they returned to the former approach. And there were people in the Department of Social Services were perfectly happy to return to it. That's how they thought welfare should be only for the deserving. And you should be a pauper before you'd be eligible for it. And in a province like Saskatchewan, where there's a lot of farmers, if you had to be a pauper before you could get welfare, that meant you lost your farm. You couldn't have any assets to speak of. So, you know, it was a value change. It was really a big change. And for the people, you know, for some of the people, this was just great. They really favored it. And for others, they just thought this wasn't how it should be at all. So I'd really like to know, what effect these innovations had on people, and social services is a good example of it. The industry department as well, there was that kind of change in values that affected people. Did I answer your question, I hope?
Yeah.
Do you think this is an interesting question, how innovation affects how individuals innovations affect things, how it affects people, how it affects the factors that are at work in the department, how it affects the whole government? Is that an interesting question?
Yeah, I think it is definitely an interesting question. People can spend years and decades trying to answer the question. But I've noticed with regards to innovation, we look at how it affects our government rather than our people. We look at it from a macro perspective rather than a micro. So I mean, like, what I've noticed is we'll do case studies and we'll look at the general population. However, what I feel like we should be doing now is looking at specific case studies and looking at specific populations and kind of directing it towards them, because in the end, like, although we come together as a consensus, I mean, it does affect each and every individual differently, and I think it would be really interesting to see maybe case studies done on that.
Yeah, I agree.
With regards to the innovation that you talked about in Saskatchewan, I think it would be really interesting to see how it would affect like transgender families or transgender individuals or even like same-sex families or things like that, because I feel like the LGBTQ community is a huge aspect of today's society, especially Canada, having one of the largest communities ever in the world existing in Canada. I feel like if we directed our studies towards them, we would be able to better understand our people and our future generation. Does that make sense?
It makes sense, and it's not a question we could answer in Saskatchewan, because at that time, people kept that secret, right? That wasn't, there was a gay deputy minister, and, some people knew and some people didn't, but, it was a different time. You could perhaps look at some of those kinds of questions now, and I agree with you. I think it would be interesting and one of the questions I would end up asking, I think, is, does an innovation, whatever it is, affect transgender or other groups of people differently than some other group? Like, it would be interesting. I think the comparative question helps you to situate something. It's one thing to ask, how did it affect them? It's another to say, compared to another group or a more, just a bunch of different people, so you get a normal mean, that you can compare it to. And that's what I tried to get with these organizations, was a normal mortality rate. What I meant by that was take out all the biased studies and then calculate the mean.
So that brings me to my second question before you ask the first question. One thing I caught on to when you were talking was keyword transparency. How do you kind of, if you want to study a particular situation, you want to figure out the factors and variables to that, how do you do that when you can't find transparency in the case studies, when you can't find case studies that are not biased? Like, how would you go about your research methods then?
Well, I think you'd have to do some interviews and see if you can't ferret out what happened. I had the advantage of working for that government, and I had worked in central agencies, both in the Treasury Board, in the Department of Finance, and in what they called Executive Council, which was the Premier's office, the Privy Council office of Saskatchewan. And it was a relatively small government, and so you always had a big portfolio. So you got a big view of things, what was going on. And that, if you were interviewing people as a researcher, if you could go and talk to some of those people who had the big view, I think you could probably get some of it. But if you were studying something like transgender issues, you'd have to talk to people at the working levels, individuals.
But, I mean, just taking that into consideration, and just like personally what I would do, even though I was studying transgender people, I would talk to people different like ethnicities and different age groups, and even like individuals that were either identified as straight or gay or bisexual or transgender. I would talk to the whole population just to find out the general consensus and how different individuals think. Like, what I would do is I would look at it from more of a micro perspective.
Yeah.
Just to kind of
And that's the
understand
advantage.
differences in discourses.
That's the advantage of case studies. And there's, as you probably know, there's a literature on how to do that, but it takes a lot of work because you really have to talk to a lot of people and in depth. But I don't think you understand something well unless you do that research. You've got to have some case studies that accompany the more quantitative research, and you've got to have something to compare it to that's different, and so that you can try to understand the thing you're studying in light of something that's different. Personal opinion. We are about to do a comparison of 2 case studies for this chapter I mentioned. I'm writing with the associate editor of the journal. So that's the first time we've done that. Let's see how that goes. You can't necessarily always get the information you wish you could get. So be it. Anybody else have a comment on the research? So I'm a person who was a public servant, but always interested in learning about innovation. So that's my particular shtick. But I've become a researcher on innovation by doing it, but I'm not a researcher like your professors at York are.
But can I ask you a question about what it is like to be a researcher and a public servant at the same time? Do you find people are uncomfortable talking to you or giving you information because they're afraid you might be in a position to exercise discipline or something? Do you find that you're suspected of violating confidentiality? I mean, what are the tensions that an insider doing research about his or her own organization faces?
That's a really interesting question. I would say that I was never aware of that. I was pretty careful until the end to always show what I'd written to my boss before I published it. I was on a program with Ian Green one time to discuss ethical issues, and there was a big foo-for-ah about something with the federal government, and he said, "Oh, I don't think you should do that." And what I was talking about had nothing to do with that, but the journalist who had been writing about it was on the panel, and he didn't think my name should appear in the same place as that person. So I didn't go. So it is an issue. I once tried to get somebody to hire me with an agreement to work half-time on my research. He wouldn't agree. But I never felt that there was either much interest or much value attached to what I was doing. Success in the government didn't come from doing research and publishing in journals and publishing a journal. They didn't mind, as long as it didn't interfere with my work, but they didn't hold that to be valuable, whereas I did, which is why I did it. So that was, I wish they thought it was more valuable, but that was okay, because then they didn't bother me, right? They didn't try to interfere, they didn't try to tell me what to do.
When I think of innovative governments, I don't think of the Saskatchewan government in the mid-80s as particularly innovative.
I'm talking about the government of the 70s and early 80s, the Blakely government.
You mean the Blakely?
Yeah.
But I would have gone to 1944 when Tom Douglas first came in, because he really instituted some big changes.
That's true.
And I would have thought that would have been perhaps the more interesting period to consider. One also has the benefit of a bit more time elapsed, so the issues of confidentiality that David mentioned might not affect your research as much.
I only started writing about this in the late 1980s, after I'd left the Saskatchewan government. And as we argue in our books, I think that the Blakely government was a very innovative government, number one, 160 innovations and counting. But the other thing is that we knew about that government. We were writing about something we knew about. And because of where I'd worked, I knew quite a lot about practically every innovation we wrote about. I was the one who identified most of them. The Tommy Douglas government, I only knew as much as anybody else does. And while there were a few public servants and politicians, I didn't talk to politicians for the most part, civil servants around who'd worked in that government, I wasn't looking for a project on the most innovative government. I walked away from that government saying to myself, this was the McLaughlin government I'm talking about now, this was a really innovative government. Somebody should write a book about it. Because people wrote about the Douglas government already. I said that, and then when nobody did, I did it. So I just was writing about something I knew about, and I didn't know anything much at all about the Tommy Douglas government. So that's why I chose that. I knew something about it. And do you buy my argument that if this is how I defined it as came to believe it was an innovative government. First of all, I had worked in 3 governments before I moved there to work for the Blakeney government, and I had seen what those 3 other governments were doing. So when I saw new things, I was able to personally say this is innovative from my own experience. But also, as I say, we counted 160 things that Saskatchewan did, first, second, or third, in Canada and the USA, as far as we could find out. Do you buy that that's an innovative government?
Well, I'm not quite so certain what your definition of innovation is. So I would have...
It's in my book. I define it the same way as Rogers, Everett Rogers.
160 innovations, I don't quite know.
I just defined it for you. The first, second, or third time something had been done in Canada or North America by a government. That's my definition. So it's a population definition, or a community definition.
So a policy change that had been done 3 times previously wouldn't be innovation.
Correct. Do you have a comment on that? I'm waiting for a response. Yes.
Where do you expect to get your funding for your next research?
Well, I applied to SSHRC and they turned it down. SSHRC's been cut. You know about SSHRC? You know what SSHRC is?
Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council.
Okay.
So that's the federal government's funding for the social sciences and humanities. And to my knowledge, it's the only place you can go for funding for research in Canada in those areas. If there are a few others, but they wouldn't fund what I'm working on. So I've been encouraged to try again. I'm trying to wind myself up to that. I'm the kind of person who doesn't like to let barriers stand in the way of something I'd really like to do. And my answer always ends up being, well, I'll just do it myself, right? So that is my option. I'll just pay my way out to Saskatchewan and rent a hotel room and stay there for a month next summer and see what I can accomplish. I could maybe do that, come out of my own pocket, but I think we have a marvelous opportunity here. This is the only government where the innovations have been documented for the whole government, ever. I mean, this is gold for researchers, right? And I think we ought to learn what we can from it. We shouldn't just say something else is more interesting. It's more interesting to them, not me. So those are the 2 options I can see. So next time SSHRC has a competition, it takes me a month to prepare a SSHRC application. And I'm not all that good at it either, So, and the thing is, there are so many competing issues, like the one that was raised here, transgender issues. The issues that academics are interested in now are different. And there's no courses on innovation, right? If there were courses, if this is something people were actively researching, you might find you could get money for it, but you know, it tends to be a bit what's popular. And, you know, there's an argument for that. It's what people are interested in. So, I don't know. But I'm being encouraged by him. It's just so much work. Most people, I'm told, who apply for SSHRC grants don't get it until about the fourth time they apply.
Wow.
I don't know why that would be exactly so, except that potentially there's a learning curve in how to write an application, but I don't think my learning curve's been very good. And I'm an adjunct professor. I'm not a full-time faculty member. My background is as a public servant, so that's not an ideal background in my opinion, or at least the people on these committees are academics, and I don't know if they would. I do lots of research and writing and publishing, but I don't know. They don't give you any feedback on this, whether they think that's an interesting person to fund. Don't know. So there's questions.
But I see people are beginning to have to head
Go to
off to
classes and things.
So let me draw this formally to a close, and anyone who wants to follow up with Eleanor
Yes, please do.
informally can do so.
Looking for input.
In thanking you for your innovative presentation, I want to bestow on you one of the most coveted items at York University. It is literally impossible to buy. The only way you can get this is by giving a talk at McLaughlin College.
Oh,
So you
wow.
qualify.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Oh, yes. If you can drink this much, you're tough.